So this is a presentation on what we as individual citizens and as groups of citizens can do to fight back when there's a problem in our schools. So, help, there's science denial in my schools. What do I do? And this is something that NCSE was created in many ways to address that exact question and to be a clearinghouse of information for people as they deal with those sorts of problems in their own communities. In the last few years, we've had fairly high-profile pieces of legislation that we've been dealing with all across the country. This is about 22 states that we've seen bills that we were tracking and working on with people on the ground. We always succeed best when we're working with people on the ground. And you can imagine we're based in the Bay Area. It's hard to go into Missouri and say, "Hi, I'm from California. I want to tell you how to run your schools." It works much better when we're working through a group like Missouri Citizens for Science, Kansas Citizens for Science, other such groups. I'm going to turn off my webcam just for a second, but we'll continue broadcasting the screen. There are Citizens for Science groups all over the states. Those of you who are already part of those, I hope that this training helps you be more effective than you already are, and you're already incredibly important parts of the work that's going on out there. And those of you who live in states where there's not something like that, or where you're not already connected with a group like that, get in touch with me, and I'll try to connect you with those sorts of resources. The biggest challenge that we face is that the levels of the educational system that have the greatest influence on how science is taught are the ones that are the least accessible, the hardest to know what's actually happening on the ground. So, if Congress is doing something bad, everyone knows about that. It makes front page news. When a bad bill is filed in a state legislature, it's easy to keep track of that and to find out about it. Those can't slip through the cracks. State boards of ed, but the federal government doesn't say anything really about content in the classroom, and state legislatures rarely and are really shouldn't do that, even when they do. On the other hand, groups like state boards of education uh, pass science standards that tell us how this is supposed to be taught, what teachers are supposed to cover. They adopt textbooks in many states, so saying this is what textbooks you're allowed to use. Uh, they decide what is and isn't on the tests that are given statewide. So that's a lot more influential and easier to keep track of, but often a forgotten part of state government, not as well covered by the media. Local school boards, local principals, individual administrators have a bigger role in deciding what should be on what is the curriculum. They translate from the fairly broad guidelines that are in the state standards and translate those into the very concrete curriculum that goes to the teachers, that decides what actually happens in the classroom. And at the end of the day, teachers have tremendous autonomy to make that final decision of what is or isn't going to happen in their classroom. They can just decide that they don't want to cover a certain topic, and as long as no one complains, they can probably get away with that. Or if they want to introduce creationism or introduce climate change denial or other sorts of things, they can probably get away with it. And it's a lot harder to monitor what's happening in 17,000 or more school districts across the country and what's happening in each of the science classrooms in that school district. And this is one of many reasons why it's so important to us at NCSE and to science education in general that there be local activists who are being watchful and who are working hard to make sure that things go right. We know from surveys that have been done of teachers that 1 teacher in 8 of high school biology teachers advocates for creationism in the classroom. Um, we know that that's happening. We don't get anywhere near that level of reports back. We're not getting calls from 1 school district in 8. That would be 2,000 school districts calling us a year. It's happening, but we're not necessarily hearing about it. And maybe you on the ground are not either, but you're closer to it. You're more likely to hear about it than we would be. And part of the problem is that the places where a problem like that is most likely to show up are the places where it's least likely that anyone in the community minds. Communities with a lot of scientists in them, with people who want to see their kids taught evolution, hire teachers who want to teach evolution. Communities that are often less cosmopolitan, less urban, less religiously diverse, more religiously conservative, are going to tend to hire teachers who would like to be teaching creationism. So the places where we hear something happening are in that middle ground of places that are doing okay. They're not super science heavy, but they're not the most hostile places where the biggest problems are likely to come up. So part of what I'm hoping that with your help we'll be able to do is really expand our reach and be able to hear more about what we know is happening out there. There's the from these surveys, from anecdotal reports, often when we hear about something, a teacher is confronted about teaching creationism and will say, well, sure, I do that. I've been doing that for 20 years and no one ever had a problem before. So we know it's happening and often deeply entrenched in schools, and something needs to be done about it. It's a serious problem. So to make this concrete, as we're talking about some of the strategies that are involved, I want to use two case studies as examples of the sorts of things that Citizens for Science groups and NCSE and individual advocates on the ground often find themselves confronted with. One case, since I just came back last week from Texas, where they did a big textbook adoption battle over science textbooks, I'm going to use that a slightly modified, a little bit simplified version of what happened in Texas, where imagine that the books that have been submitted for adoption are all good. They teach evolution well, they teach climate change well. They're all of them ought to be adopted. There's a block of people who want to add creationist material to them or block the books that cover evolution the best. And imagine that there's another block that's firmly committed to voting against any of those changes, and that you live in one of the few districts that are represented by a swing vote on that decision. How will you and your neighbors work to make things better? The second case study is at sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. Imagine that you hear from a friend who has a child in eighth grade. You don't have kids in school. You hear that this climate change denial video is being screened. You do a little bit of research. You learn about the problems in this movie. You realize that it misrepresents the science, that scientists are misquoted in it, and that it was mailed out to teachers by this ideologically driven advocacy group that's trying to get its political agenda into classrooms by sending out free copies of these DVDs. Since you don't have kids in the schools, you don't have a direct line to the teacher or to the other people in the district. What can you do to help your friend? How can you stop this misinformation from being in these schools? So we'll use those two examples because they really do represent the extremes of what can go on. So the first step, no matter what, well, actually, before I talk about that first step, let's sort of step zero is to get in touch with us at NCSE. Sometimes we will have already heard about something like this that's happening, and we can help you help connect you with other people who are already working on it. Or we have a history in the community. We dealt with something there 3 years before, 4 years before, a decade ago, 20 years ago, and we can connect you with the people who were involved then so that you're not building something from scratch. You can build on the work that other people already did in your community. And that also puts you on our radar so that we know that this is happening, so that 5 years from now, if someone calls us, we can put them in touch with you. But the questions that we're going to ask and the questions that you should ask when you first hear about this are going to be really important. The basic reporter's questions: who, what, when, where, why, how is this happening? Who are the decision makers? Who's doing what? What happened? What's going to happen? When is it going to happen? Who makes the decisions? All of that context. And as you start investigating and as you start making a plan, you're going to realize that there's other things that you need to dig up to better understand the circumstances. It's important to set clear goals before you start acting, certainly to gather all that information before you decide to take any action. If you if you go in and act without having really thought through all of what's likely to happen, you can just wind up sort of messing yourself up and stepping on your own toes. Uh, oh, some people are looking at my desktop and say it's more cluttering than mine. Okay. Um, just looking through the questions and making sure that I'm not missing anything. Sorry. So setting clear goals is really important. Think about um, what will it mean to win. If you can, if you can do that, you're going to be in a much better place to actually get there. But also be clear for yourself. You don't necessarily want to tell other people, but be clear for your own purposes. What's the worst outcome that you would be prepared to accept? Um, what are you prepared to call a victory, even if it's not everything that you had set out to achieve? In thinking about that, you'll start to realize what the core issue is, the principle underlying everything else that you're doing. What is it that motivates you? What is it that has to happen that's not happening? Identifying those core principles, what sometimes people talk about as a mission statement or a vision, is what makes it easy for you to share that with other potential allies. To say, look, we're all working for this same goal. The particular outcome that we are concerned about might be different, but we all agree on this core principle. And also be thinking about, is there something longer term? In the case of the teacher who's showing the video, you may assume going in that, oh, this teacher is trying to promote that same ideological agenda as the creationist groups. But in talking to people, you may realize, no, that's not the problem. The problem is this teacher didn't know the difference, didn't know that this video was not appropriate for the classroom, thought that it was presenting accurate science. And in that case, instead of making your goal maybe to get the teacher in trouble, your immediate goal may still be to get that DVD out of the classroom, but the long-term goal is to make better training available to teachers in the classroom. And having thought about that, you can realize have that deeper sense and start building something for the long term. As you're setting goals, think about what your timeline is. Are you being too ambitious? If the board meeting to adopt textbooks is next week, you the goals that you're going to set for yourself in terms of organizing might be, you should probably set them to be a little bit less ambitious than if you have a year to plan and organize. And similarly, be thinking clearly about who can actually do the things that you want to do. Are your goals realistic given the political situation? Can the people who you have influence over make the changes that you want to see happen? And identifying decision makers is an absolutely core part of any sort of organizing around this or community organizing in general. Thinking clearly about who decides what's happening. And this is about individuals. A lot of times when we're thinking about a bad piece of legislation, we're thinking, how do I influence the legislature? How do I influence the committee that decides this? But really, it's about that committee is composed of individuals, and each of them has their own motivations. So in the example of the textbook adoption that I was talking about, those three core, the swing votes, those three votes are going to be really different. How you reach out to them is going to be really different than how you reach out to someone who's a committed vote for creationist changes or someone who's a committed vote against those changes. So you're going to have to tailor your message a little bit differently for each of them. Be clear about what the limits of those decision makers are. Can they make the changes that you want to make? Both as a matter of law, does the state constitution forbid them from doing the things that you might be asking them for? Or by their own political constraints, are they just not, has they made it clear that they absolutely will not ever do the thing that you want to do? And is there somebody else who can get you there where you need to go? Be clear about the when and the where. Again, doing that recon, knowing the situation, knowing the landscape beforehand is absolutely critical. And being able to put yourself in their shoes. And this is a key skill, and we're gonna come back to this several times today, because being able to even for people who you disagree with strongly and whose perspective you think is profoundly wrong, if you can imagine what motivates them, what gets them to do what they're doing, how do they make their choices, what are their motivations? If you can understand that, you can understand how to perhaps change the decisions that they're going to make, or at least you can make clearer decisions about the tactics that might be effective to either convince them or at least to shape the decisions that they make. Similarly, with who they're going to trust, someone who was elected to office as by a constituency largely of the religious right maybe is not the people that you want to try to influence by bringing a delegation of scientists from the university to speak to them. That might not be who they want to listen to. They may not even trust a group of scientists. They may find them, you know, antithetical to their identity in a way that you might bring them a delegation of members of the clergy who share your concerns about the textbooks and not seeing them watered down. Whereas someone who is elected from a university community is likely to want to hear from that delegation of scientists, and the delegation of clergy may well be far less effective with them. Um, Having that breadth, being able to call on a group of clergy or a group of scientists, a group of business leaders, people from, if you have a particular ethnic community in your area that is particularly influential over this policymaker, being able to reach out to that group, whatever it might be, is one of the really important things in organizing in general, and especially around this, being able to connect directly to the decision maker. And in reaching out to them and building that coalition is one of the most important and often the most difficult things that as citizens for science groups organize, one of the most difficult things for them to figure out how to do effectively. And it's one of the things that works the best. It's where they spend the most of the time, and it's where the most payoff comes from. And the challenge is the same when you're going to a group of scientists and asking if they will come with you to meet with the board member. What's in it for them? And it's not just pecuniary advantage. Oh, they might get more research grants or something. Sometimes that's the sort of motivation that works with people, but there's usually a deeper motive at work. How can you do that for them? How can you connect with them on that deeper level so that they will share your core principles, they will share your message, they'll share your goals, and they'll want to work with you and help you. And something that I often think about is this quote from a civil rights leader, that if you're in a coalition and you're comfortable, you know the coalition isn't broad enough. Always be thinking about who's not in this group. Who could I be reaching out to who might be willing to help if I would reach out to them, if I would think about a different way to connect with this. So let's think about this in the case of the the issue with a video being shown in a classroom. If you can either raise your hands or use the question interface, I didn't give you enough information about the community to say, oh, well, we need to be sure to reach out. There's a large Hispanic community, so we need to find a leader in the Hispanic community, or we need, the politics of it. I haven't specified enough to say, but what sort of skills do you want to recruit as part of that coalition for an effort like that? I'll turn back on the camera and turn off the screen sharing so that I can see. Oops. So that I can see the questions. Or you can raise the hand using that interface, and I'll let you share the audio. Raleigh McLemore, did you want to say something, Raleigh?
Yeah, that's me. How you doing, Josh?
Hi. So do you have an idea? I think you had your hand up even before this,
I
but
came in late, so why don't you let other people talk?
okay. So are there other folks? Kim Johnson.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I didn't know this old mic would work. Um, you say, what kind of people do you want to recruit? And of course, I'll say that every situation is probably a little bit different. But in general, we found that if we recruit the broadest range of people possible, and in particular, scientists for the authority behind you, clergy. We went out to get clergy. We got clergy, and they were actually, to tell the truth, probably some of our most influential people with the Board of Education. We have a different situation now in New Mexico. Teachers, terribly important to have teachers in there because they know how the systems work, and if you can get them, administrators. Administrators are often very shy about joining, but sometimes not. In fact, at one time we even got a couple of the Board of Education people to join us, and that was, we knew we were
Sure.
on our way to success at that point. But also people with kids in school. And one thing that we did find, going back to an earlier slide, is that you're not going to find that everybody agrees with you 100%. You're still always going to get this question about why not talk about this in science? And there's an answer to that. And so you have to bring people along, and you have to train them up, so to speak, and say, hey, there's no problem with talking about this in school. It's just the situation on which you discuss it. So I say everybody, but in particular, scientists, teachers, clergy in particular. And if you can grab some of the politicians, that is fantastic, and get them on your side. So let somebody else talk.
Yeah, and in the questions interface, Raleigh suggests unions also. Getting labor support can be really valuable. Unions have a lot of experience organizing. Really, the two groups out there that have the most experience organizing are labor and the clergy. I mean, it's professional organizing in both cases, and being able to connect in with that, and both have a lot of respect in different parts of the political community.
One of our problems, Josh, with we interface with the unions right away, but we didn't. We have been very, very careful not to form a formal alliance with the unions and broadcast that, because there are many places where unions are not looked upon positively. And so talking about who do you recruit, it's kind of the other side of that is who don't you recruit? Well, it's good to have the union involved and be on their side and so forth and so on, but we had found we had to do that under the table. We were turning people off.
Yeah, and this is something where that organizing skill can be key, and finding someone who works with the union and has the skills from the union, but isn't necessarily working with you as a union organizer, is in that capacity, but is still able to share those skills. And that's something Shelley Callahan says, I'm not good at talking to people one-on-one, so I need to find someone who's good at that. Finding a public speaker, finding someone who's comfortable speaking in crowds, doing that organizing. Cheryl Shepard-Adams from Kansas mentions recruiting people with communications and interpersonal skills. And if there's someone who works in public relations, or is a current reporter or a former reporter who might be willing. Reporters can sometimes be hinky about working for an advocacy group, even in a volunteer capacity. They want to maintain their independence. But someone who's retired or who works in journalism in an advocacy context anyway and is willing to do that can be really valuable as a liaison to the press, and having rather than having to invent that from scratch. Raleigh McLemore also mentions groups, professional groups, either societies or groups like the Exploratorium that have forums where people can communicate. Vic Hutchinson, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to make a comment about, you said, who do they trust? The decision makers? Here in Oklahoma, we've been very successful in combating legislation, creationist legislation. And one of the reasons is we include clergy members in our board and in our lobbying efforts. We go in to talk to a legislator, they look around and say, oh, you all can't be atheist, and they listen. This, of course, is opposed to the new atheist and some of the people that criticize us for being accommodationist. But in practice, when you're trying to defeat legislation, you have to be pragmatic in politics. And I'd like to emphasize that point. It's strength in numbers, and the numbers that you have across the board, including people that have already been discussed, very important. Another point is economic impact. I don't know about other places, but here in Oklahoma, medical tech industry has blossomed hugely. And there's even an organization in Oklahoma City that represents all of those med tech companies. They are finding it difficult to recruit scientists because of the attempts in the legislature to have creationist bills. And they have been, at least behind the scenes and with their own lobbyists, very helpful. So that's another group that can help.
Yeah, and if you can get the Chamber of Commerce is often really concerned uh, about how to make great schools, and so sometimes they can be really effective partners on efforts like this. Sometimes their politics is not quite what we might like in terms of these particular issues. They don't want to step on toes, so they're not willing to help publicly, but maybe they're prepared to help behind the scenes. Brandon Hott asks whether clergy help with climate change issues. Yeah, I mean, partly it's just that having that collar confers a certain measure of respect from policymakers, and these are, as we're going to talk about, at root they're moral issues. For us, they're scientific issues. It's about truth. It's about facts. It's about evidence. But the opposition is all about it's this moral argument. And so having the clergy there to say, look, this is a moral argument too, and have the experience of being able to articulate that case that scientists often are less comfortable doing, can be really effective. And also can be great. They're great networkers. They're great with community organizing and all those sorts of efforts. If there's and Keith Miller adds especially the evangelical Christian community, where there's the creation care movement, and other faith communities have similar efforts to bring climate change really directly into the pastoral care. He mentions groups like the Evangelical Environmental Network, Interfaith Power and Light, Climate Parents, that's doing a lot of outreach through parents specifically, not in a religious context necessarily. So yeah, I mean, all of that. And this is an iterative process. You'll be thinking about potential allies, and you'll work on it for a while, and you'll suddenly realize people who go birding are going to be might be really concerned about this. I should contact my local Audubon Society and see if someone there would be willing to help. And you'll just build, and you'll be sitting on the bus one day, and you'll just have that occur to you. Oh, I should do this. I should contact them. How do I reach out to them? How do I convince them that this is an issue that they should spend time on? It's not you don't do it and then you're done. It's something that builds over time. So I'm going to go back to the slideshow if I can find it. Oops, that's not it. Sorry. There we go. And one of the sort of groups of people that is well worth trying to recruit, as we talked about, people who have that leadership experience, the organizing experience, and being careful about how much leadership you do give people if you don't know them well already, but also being careful about yourself, not to let ego take over. It's so easy to say, this is my effort. I started this. I should be running it until the end of the show, and to be able to step back and give some of that power to new people, and to give them the space to try to take that leadership role. Enough space that they can prove themselves, but not so much that if they let you down, that it ruins the whole thing, is really the measure of, for groups like Vic Hutchinson, for those who don't know, is the leader of and I think founder of the Citizens for Science group in Oklahoma. Kim Johnson, who was talking before, is one of the leaders of the group in New Mexico. All of these groups, part of what makes them so successful is that they're not one person. There's a board of people who work together as equals, and that can use all of their skills to their own best advantages, and can share and delegate among themselves, and that new people, which makes it clear that new people can join that group by demonstrating their own interest and abilities. So give people that opportunity, and don't let ego get in the way of stopping. Of letting someone do that just because you rightly feel a certain proprietary sense over something that you've built. There's nothing wrong with that, but don't let it overshadow the needs of the issue and of the broader agenda. And so in planning a strategy before you take action, I think it's worth mapping out a strategy. And this is based on uh, trainings that the Midwest Academy does. And this is a book that they published called Organizing for Social Change, where they have a bunch of worksheets like this and a lot of really good advice. If you find them doing a training in your area, or if you can get a copy of that book, there's really a lot of valuable stuff that in an hour with you today, I'm not going to be able to get to. Hopefully, over the course of all of the trainings that we have planned, we'll cover a lot of the ground in there. And as I mentioned, we are doing a session on lobbying next time, where a lot of the decisions that we make, a lot of the discussion we were having about finding allies, finding decision makers, and identifying them, we're going to go into a lot more depth there. But there's a lot of valuable material out there in books like the Midwest Academy's book and other online trainings on community organizing that I would encourage you to look at as well. But everyone that you talk to will agree that having a strategy before you go out and start doing stuff is really crucial. So setting goals, we talked about what to do about that. The scale of your organization is going to vary. If you're just starting out, if you're just one person who is concerned about what's happening in your schools, your organization is you. The assets available to you are your assets. The liabilities and limits that you're going to have to overcome are your liabilities and limits. But as that grows, as you start having allies and start having a plan and realizing, in order to succeed, I need a list of 1,000 people with their email addresses and phone numbers. I need someone with media experience who can help me get the word out to the press. Whatever it is, as you start building that up, think about what assets you have available to you through that organization, but also what you're going to need to do to build the organization itself in order to succeed. Be clear about who your friends are. Groups that might not be part of your coalition or part of your group, but that will help you when the time comes, and who's going to stand against you. And again, being able to put yourself in their shoes and think about what motivates them, what issues are they concerned about? Are there ways that you can make them not be involved in this issue by addressing their concerns some other way through some other venue? And think about the power structures involved. What power do you have over the people who are going to be making decisions? And what power does your opposition have? Are there ways that you can limit the power that they have, or increase the power that you have? We talked about targets. Who makes the decision? That's the ultimate target. The individual, the swing voter, is the main target of what you're going to do. But also, you may realize that yes, your state board of education member is the swing vote, and that's who you have to reach. But that you, as regular members of the community, are not the most influential. They're going to be listening a lot more carefully to major donors. And so you should do some research through what is usually a public record for state elections, of who were the major donors in that race. Who were their major campaign staff? Who were their supporters? What groups endorsed them that were crucial to their support? And what groups would they be afraid to lose the support of going forward? Do you have more influence on those secondary targets, perhaps, than on the primary target, who is a long-time incumbent and is not likely to get unseated unless those big supporters walk away? So who are those decision makers? Who influences them? And how do you exert your power? And then thinking about targets. And again, this is an iterative process. As you make decisions about who your targets are, it changes what your organizational concerns are. It might change what your goals are, especially your short-term goals. It might change who you realize your friends and enemies are. And the tactics are situational. It's not, a lot of times people see something wrong and they say, I'm going to go to change.org and I'm going to make a petition and I'm going to send a petition in, and they're going to know that something's wrong. Sometimes that's the right way forward, but sometimes a petition isn't what's most helpful. So thinking about the power structures, thinking about the specifics of your situation, the timeline involved, who makes the decision, when they make the decision, all of that, what power can you exert, all of that influences the tactics that are going to work. Tactics that are successful build on the power that you already have, and ideally increase the amount of power that you have going forward, and they make sense. ideally they make sense to you and are outside the expectations of the opposition. Because if the opposition knows what you're going to do, they're in a position to try to counteract it. Whereas if you can surprise them without surprising your allies, if you have to explain to your allies why this is a really good idea, you're going to spend a lot of time on that and not a lot of time actually doing the thing. So have something that's clear and that's within the experience of your allies and outside the experience and expectations of your opposition. What we have always found at NCSE, and I'm sure that the Citizens for Science groups, the folks who've been involved in those will say the same thing, that it always works best to start out quietly behind the scenes and to be nice to people. If you go in threatening lawsuits, the first reaction of anybody is going to be, well, I guess I should have my lawyer here. And as soon as the lawyer is sitting next to them, they can't say anything because it might turn up as testimony in a later lawsuit. Whether you file a suit now or 6 months from now, if you have 6 months of good relations, you're more likely to accomplish something before you file that lawsuit if it becomes necessary. But making those threats, making enemies before you have to. Sometimes you have to make enemies. That's fine. But don't go in assuming that the person that you're sitting down with is an enemy. You can always escalate. You can always talk to someone's boss. You can always go to court or go from the state board and try to get the legislature to get involved. But it's often harder to ramp down. It's to take someone who you've made an enemy and make them a friend so that they'll work with you. In thinking about message and in thinking about tactics, as scientists, we tend to think in terms of evidence, in terms of the data. And yes, as this cartoon illustrates really wonderfully, you've got Tiktaalik there. This is around the time that the so-called fishapod was discovered, this great transitional fossil, and they're crawling out of the ocean, gobbling up creationism. Scientists who I'll often talk to will say, we've got the fossils, we win. But that's not how creationists come at it. So it's not about the evidence in quite the same way, and understanding where the opposition is coming from, why people are trying to water down the textbooks, why people are mailing out this bogus DVD to teachers is important to be able to counteract that. This is a figure that a creationist produced in the 80s for a pamphlet that he was distributing, and I think it just brilliantly encapsulates the underlying dynamic. Here you've got everything that's wrong in society: mom-child liberation, hard rock, genetic engineering, alcohol, terrorism, homosexuality, inflation is up there, just crime, anything that's wrong are the fruits of philosophical evolution in this figure. From the tree of biological evolution, which is soaking up sin from the soil of unbelief. How do you solve all of these problems in one fell swoop? With the axe of scientific creationism here, you chop down the tree of biological evolution. So when they're attacking Tiktaalik, say, when they're saying, well, that's not really a transitional fossil, the point is not about Tiktaalik. And if you respond by arguing about Tiktaalik, the actual conversation that's going on, you're not really part of it because they're making a moral argument. And this came home really clear to me in the first public meeting that I attended around these issues when I was a grad student in Kansas. There was a guy who stood up and said, I'm a father, I have 2 sons, I want them both to be doctors, and I don't want them to grow up to be little Joseph Mengeles. I don't want them to grow up, I don't want to be producing little Kansas Nazis. And that's what he was afraid was going to happen if evolution was in the textbooks. Now, he's wrong, and it's perfectly reasonable to say why he's wrong, but to recognize that there is, the desire to make sure that your kids are raised right and with a code of ethics, that the schools are not undermining what parents are teaching about ethics at home, that's a perfectly reasonable and valid concern. And it's important to acknowledge that and to treat the legitimate aspect of that while separating it from the scientific issue, which is not really related. And we at NCSE talk about this in terms of the 3 pillars of science denial, the 3 consistent rhetorical and strategic themes that run through. You can find them in today's intelligent design creationists. You see them in William Jennings Bryan's testimony in the Scopes trial 90 years ago. You see it in the tobacco industry's efforts to cover up the role of tobacco in cancer. You see it on the climate change front. You see it from anti-vaccine movement. Across the board, these same 3 themes come up. Attacking the science, of course. It would not be science denial if you were not attacking the science, right? by definition. The second pillar, the central pillar, really is this moral argument, the idea that if climate change is true, it's going to destroy our liberties and the capitalist system that has given us our power in the world and our moral righteousness as a nation. Right? That's the argument. So therefore, we shouldn't be teaching about climate change. Evolution, if we teach that children that they come from monkeys, they'll behave like monkeys. A common creationist argument. It's so therefore we shouldn't teach about evolution. It's not, on some level, these are arguments not about the actual science, what's factual and what's not, but it's something much deeper and much more important to people in some ways than the actual facts of the matter. And it's being able to respond to those and separate those issues is crucial. And finally, the third pillar is this idea of demanding equal time, or that fairness, that it's only fair that we as taxpayers get to decide what's taught in our schools. It's only fair that children be presented with both sides so that they can make up their own minds about what they learn. It's only fair that I, as a consumer, be allowed to buy whatever light bulbs or appliances, whatever kind of car. Don't force me to buy a Prius. That freedom argument is really powerful. So while acknowledging and being absolutely straightforward in talking about how science denial is wrong, both factually and I would say morally, that misinforming children is wrong, certainly does harm. Evolution, climate change, these are important issues for the citizens of tomorrow. These are important issues that people have a right to know about in their classrooms and to be informed accurately about. It does them harm if they're misinformed. But it's not there is a logic to it, even if it's bad logic, if it's based on bad premises, there is a logic to it, and understanding that logic enough that you can understand why someone would be convinced by the argument is crucial to being able to formulate a message that will move people away from that argument, that you acknowledge the genuine concerns and move people away from the bogus attacks on science. Because science denial ultimately is driven by personal identity, the idea that I'm a Christian, so I can't accept evolution. That may not be true, but it's a common perception, and being able to address that identity is the way that you get them to even talk about the evidence. And these deep, real concerns, acknowledging those, recognizing them as valid, but not necessarily relevant to what should be in textbooks. Those are the ways that you essentially, I talk about this as getting people's fingers out of their ears, getting them to even hear what you have to say about why evolution belongs in a biology class, why climate change belongs in public schools. And this is a challenge that when the National Academy of Sciences was revising this booklet, and for those of you who haven't seen this book, it's a great resource. They did a lot of work on it to make it accessible and useful for exactly these sorts of situations. If there are state board members who are on the fence and confused, this is a great resource to give to them, and it's available as a free PDF from the National Academy's Press. If you go to nap.edu/SEC for Science, Evolution, and Creationism, you can get a free PDF of it. When they were developing that, they did a lot of audience research. They did polls, they did focus groups to try to figure out what works, what makes people more likely to accept the validity of evolution. And the same logic would apply to climate change, and there's a lot of research. Groups like climatecommunications.org summarizes a lot of it. Groups like Skeptical Science also do a lot of summarizing of the findings that are published in things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's regular reports, making them accessible and trying to use what's known about the cognitive psychology and the message strategy to be able to reach people. And what they found was basically the messages that work for making people more likely to accept evolution, the messages that work respond to the three pillars. So the first one is talking about how important evolution is to medical research. Evolution saves lives. Not only is it good science, it's essential science. Talking about the compatibility of religious faith and the acceptance of evolution undercuts that second pillar. It's a response to that moral argument. It says, look, the Pope doesn't have a problem with evolution. 13,000 Christian clergy have signed the Clergy Letter Project saying that they don't see a conflict between evolution and their religious faith. Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, former head of the Human Genome Project, is an evangelical Christian who sees no conflict between evolution and his religious faith. There are a lot of faith communities that have issued statements that we've compiled in a book called Voices for Evolution that you can find on the NCSC website, ncsc.com/voices, with statements from Methodists, Lutherans, Jewish groups, Islamic groups across the board, talking about how evolution is not at odds with their understanding of their faith. And finally, turning the fairness argument around by saying, instead of it's unfair not to give kids both sides, it's unfair to impose a religious agenda or a political agenda in the case of climate change on students. It's unfair for one person to use that influence to make this cryptic, to abuse the science, to misinform students in service of this agenda. And all of this works best when it's coming from people who share those values and that cultural background. So the religious argument in the case of climate change, I, as a Jewish agnostic from the Bay Area, it's going to be harder for me to make that religious argument to a Baptist school board member in Arkansas. I'm not part of his tribe. But someone who goes to the same church or who has some other social connection with that person, that they're able to connect and say, look, I'm your kind of person. I have your same values, and you know that I'm a good person, and I accept evolution. That's going to mean a lot to open that conversation up and to make someone open to having that conversation about the scientific evidence. Being personal is absolutely crucial to the process. We all, as scientists, we tend to want to be very rational about what we do, to be up in our heads, rather than to speak from the heart or from the gut, as it were. But what motivates us, the reason that you're taking, that I'm so honored for you to be willing to take the time out of your day to be here with me on this webinar. We're going to have question and answer at the end of it and a chance to talk. It's scheduled for an hour. I'm happy to go longer. The reason that I'm spending this time, the reason that you're here with me, is that you care about this. This is something that's important to you. And it's not just because, wow, science is really great. There's something deeper at work. And if you can talk about what that is, that helps you build those connections to get people's fingers out of their ears, to get past the initial resistance that they might have. For me, that personal connection is my kid. I've got an 18-month-old son at home who's going to grow up in a world. It's going to be shaped by climate change. He's going to have to make decisions. If tomorrow every coal-fired power plant in the world was shut down, climate change would still continue just from the inertia of the climate system. He's going to have to deal with decisions that my generation, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, that they made. He's going to have to deal with it. He deserves the best information to be able to make choices for his own life, to vote for policies that are going to make the world a better place. And in terms of evolution, it's the foundation of modern biology. We live in a world where there are hobbyist genetic engineers. To understand the consequences of that, to understand how we regulate that, what we do with personal genomic information, how we interpret, how doctors can use that if he wants to be a doctor, but if he wants to be a patient and understand the newest research, he has to understand evolution. And that's what the schools are for preparing him to be a citizen. These are citizenship issues for me, and it's about the future. Think about, what's your story? What's a 30-second summary of why you've taken time out of your day to go and meet with this policymaker, to spend time dealing with this issue rather than all of the other things that perhaps you could do? What makes this important to you? And as you're thinking about strategies, as you're thinking about tactics, be planning for the future. Think about, if you do a petition, if that's a strategy a tactic that makes sense, what do you do now that you've got a list of 1,000 names and email addresses and phone numbers? How can you use that to do the next thing? How can you build on that? Maybe you contact those same people and say, we're going to have a rally. Will anyone volunteer to organize, to do crowd control, to help talk to your neighbors? Will you share this petition? Now that you've signed this petition, write back to them and say, will you ask 5 friends to sign it also? How do you build on that? How do you take that energy that's coming in and turn it into resources, into something more permanent down the road? Also be thinking about what happens if your plan doesn't work. you've met with the State Board of Education member, you've lobbied as much as you possibly could, and in the end, the vote goes the wrong way. What happens next? Are there things that you can do to make it easier? If you need to file a lawsuit, should you be filing? Can you be filing public records requests now so that people's motivations and underlying agenda is on the record? Can you get someone to make sure that what needs to be in the documentary record if there's a lawsuit? Can the legislature override what the State Board of Education did? And if so, how can you make what happens at the State Board of Education make it easier to go to the legislature down the road? And how can you, through what you're doing on this specific issue to respond to an immediate crisis, how do you turn that into people who will help you down the road? What a lot of the Citizens for Science groups have found, and at the end when we're having some question and answer time, I think that the Citizens for Science group leaders who are on this webinar right now will agree with me that the great danger is when there's not an immediate crisis, it's easy for people to fade away. So be planning events after the crisis so that you hold people's interest and so that they remain involved and active so that you don't have to rebuild all of that again the next time there's a crisis, because inevitably there will be. And that's where in the planning process, thinking about your long-term goals as well as the immediate goal can be really valuable. So I want to work through and do what we did before of opening up the question and answer session and talk through how we might use the strategy chart for the case of the Board of Education. But before we do that, I wanted to mention NCSC's website, our Facebook address, our Twitter account. I hope you'll all get in touch with us if you hear about anything that's going on or if you want more resources. We'll post video of this to our YouTube channel, and I hope you'll share that. I wanted to mention that next month, we're going to do that session on lobbying. The month after that, we're probably going to do a media skills workshop. The thing that when I contacted the Citizens for Science group leaders when we were planning these sessions and asked them, what's going to be most useful for you? What do you wish that you had a training in when you were getting started? The thing that they always came back to was how to recruit volunteers and how to move people from sort of the entry level, I signed a petition, to positions of greater leadership. And this first session, I thought about doing that because it was just overwhelming that that's what they wanted to hear. But I wanted to use this as a way to set the stage a little bit. But we're going to come back to that. And we're going to spend at least one webinar, if not more, talking about how to do volunteer recruitment and how to move people into positions of greater power, because it is far and away the most important and in many ways most difficult skill that we face, that the groups that are involved in this face. So I'm going to check really quick, look through the questions list, and make sure that I haven't been ignoring people for too terribly long. And then we can work through the example. And we're coming up on the end of the hour. I want to be sure that I answer everyone's questions. I don't have anywhere that I have to be. If we go for another hour of question and answer after this, that's fine by me. I know some of you are going to have to go, but so if there are questions, I'm just skimming through the questions that people have posted. Okay, and some of these I'll just respond to you individually later. One person's asking about the dates for future webinars. That's not set yet. Some of these are going to be panels, so I need to coordinate. It's not just my schedule, but it's coordinating other people's schedules and working out a time. This first one, we set the time fairly arbitrarily. We did ask people what time would work best, and there was no clear winner. So some people didn't like the time that we chose for this one, so we may experiment with that and see if a different time works better for people. But I'll get that out as soon as I can. Hopefully in the next, probably not this week because of the holiday, but as soon after that as possible. Edward Mann asks if I can provide a list of existing organizations. If you go to ncsc.com/, here I'll type this in even. if you go to ncsc.com/taking action, there is a list of the existing Citizens for Science groups, but some of those are out of date. Some of their websites aren't working right now, and some of the groups that used to be active are not always as active now as they once were. So if you are looking for a group and you see that they used to exist and it's not active anymore, get in touch with me. You all got email from me before, but email me or call, and I will get back to you and try to connect you with the leadership of those groups. And if the group is just not active anymore at all, I'll work with you to help rebuild it, because it's having those local groups is incredibly valuable. It's so important. Several people in the questions have asked if we're residents of a county or state where the problem is not happening, but it's happening nearby, what can we do? Or just asking, what do we do if we live in an area where this is happening or where this is not happening? There's a lot that can be done to improve the quality of evolution education and of climate change education. And reaching out to teachers and saying, hey, I'm a scientist, I'm a concerned parent, I'm a member of the community, how can I help you? Even just telling them that you support them when they teach about evolution and teach about climate change. These are topics that do generate a lot of pushback. Even, I was emailing with someone today who's a teacher in the Bay Area, which is not where you would expect to find serious conflicts over things, but who had been getting pushback from teachers from parents over climate change education. And certainly we know that happens over evolution, that because there's so much pressure not to teach it, the parents, it's easy. It's just easier and easier for a teacher to stop talking about it and to teach something else. And so even just the simple act of going in and meeting with the teachers in the local school, the science teachers, and saying, hey, I'm with you, I support you, I want to support that. And that's an idea that we're thinking about of trying to build into an even broader campaign, and to talk about in future webinars also, and to do some trainings around that. See who might have their hands up with questions also. I see Kim has a question. Kim, did you want to?
Yeah, quick one. Josh, can you send this out to those of us who want it in a form that we can actually steal some of the graphics off of?
Sure. Yeah, I'll
Because
post a copy of this is in Keynote. I'll make it into a PDF or a PowerPoint and put that on the NCSC site. And I'll also put some other articles and resources that went into my thinking as I was putting it together that may be useful readings.
okay, yeah, PowerPoint is what I'm thinking of, so I can crib from it. I
Exactly.
don't mind doing that. Good stuff.
Yeah, no,
Good stuff.
steal everything you can, by all means. So I want to come back now to sorry, I'm confusing myself. I'm going to come back to the slides just for a minute. And this. So in the time that we have available now, just to sort of go through this as an example of how these sorts of conversations can go, and just either as a question or raise your hand through the device. Edward Mann points out, don't assume that there's no problem just because you haven't heard of one. Talking to parents, talking to teachers, asking what they can do, asking what's going on can be really important. Building those connections so that when a crisis happens, as almost anywhere it likely will, you're ready and you have those. You've already built some of those connections beforehand. And so returning to the slideshow, and if you have questions or if you want to raise your hand through the interface, we can sort of talk through this. I've filled in some of the parts. So I'm assuming that the goal that we've set in talking about reaching out to the Board of Education is that we want to adopt the textbooks. The target is by the way that I set it up is your personal representative on the State Board of Education, who represents your district. And actually, I'm just going to pull this out like this. So that I can see the questions as they come in and still have this be visible. Oh, Tom O'Brien asks what the rest of the address is for the Science, Evolution, and Creationism. That's nap.edu/SEC. I just sent that around as an answer to the whole list. So in thinking about, so the major target obviously is the State Board of Education member here, but we might also want to work through major donors by researching on the state usually through the Secretary of State for the state, not John Kerry, but your state's Secretary of State's office will have the campaign finance reports of who donated to people, and often those are going to be the most effective way to reach. Are going to have a lot more effect on how someone votes than an average citizen writing in or even a petition being delivered. These things that I've put in italics depend on details of the situation that I haven't told you, so we can sort of set those aside for the moment. But let's assume that you live in the community, you have local connections, and let's assume, as is generally true for NCSE members, that you have some scientific expertise or at least connections to the scientific world. And assume that you're going to need, in the course of things, to build your network, to expand the network, to find funding if you need to do things that cost almost anything, and bring in more people who have political and media savvy and perhaps organizational skills. Your friends are likely to be science teachers, people in the university community. A lot of the audiences that we talked about, there are going to be people in the religious community who are going to be allies in your effort, and you should find ways to reach out to them. A saying that Jeannie Scott often uses is, one clergy member in a backwards collar is worth a dozen scientists at a public hearing. Doing that outreach early and bringing them in as allies up front can be really important. Think about who the opposition is. In a lot of states where next generation science standards are being debated right now, groups affiliated with the Tea Party are organizing against them because they connect them with the Common Core agenda, which was funded in part through the stimulus bill in 2009, and that was a big organizing point for them. And so knowing that Tea Party groups are likely to organize, they may be. Who are they going to be able to turn out? What arguments are they likely to make? Knowing beforehand how that's going to work could be really important. So what are some tactics that we think might work? I see Vic Hutchinson has his hand up, so I'll start with him. But others of you, if you have a suggestion, jump in. So Vic, fire away.
The problem of keeping people interested over time.
Yes.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. One thing we might mention are the listservs that started by NCSC and AIBS. Many of them are now defunct or inoperative, mainly because they wait until a problem arises to start posting. We separate this from our organization because we're a 501c3 organization, and I wanted to be able to talk about personalities and politicians, so I pay for it. It's independent. But I have over 920 subscribers, and I post about once a month, and I post items about evolution and climate change around the world, around the country, emphasizing, of course, Oklahoma. This keeps a large number of people occupied over time and interested, and so when that legislative bills come up, for example, I can put on there what one should do, the address, the list of people to contact, and the points to be made. And I think we really need to try to get listservs in all of the states back rejuvenated. It is a major, major help because we found, as I've said before, over and over, numbers do count. And that helps us generate a lot of messages to legislators.
Yeah, listservs are really valuable. Blogs can be really valuable for that. Twitter feeds, Facebook accounts to be able to hold on to that community. I know Kansas Citizens for Science and Florida Citizens for Science both do science cafes in communities around their states. Some of the other groups may do that as well, as a way to engage people offline as well, and those can be really effective. Some groups will have a table at the state science teachers convention,
Yeah.
and that can be a great way to maintain those contacts and to it's something that you need people to sit at the table. They don't necessarily need to be the world's experts in anything, but they need to be there. And so it's something for people to do. It's a way for people to show leadership and to remain active when there's not an immediate crisis. And okay. And Kim, did you oh, I guess you're already unmuted actually. But you
Yeah,
had
you
a
forgot to kill my mic. That's all right. I was gonna add that one thing we've done, we've been at this, I think, as long as anybody since like 1996, 97, is that after the immediate crises went up, they'd come back every 2 years for our 60-day legislator session, which didn't happen this year. But we too, 501c3, and over that length of time, we become more and more well known as a group that is not partisan in terms of providing answers to people, in particular public officials and the newspapers, reporters. So we analyze a lot of data. We do a lot of things politically on a separate listserv, of course, because we're 501c3, so it's individuals. But we are building a reputation now, and people are calling us and asking us questions. And I know the next time something comes up, that will be one of the most important things we've ever done to keep going. And the political discussions wander all over the place, and that's fine. They always come back eventually to, these 2 points: evolution and climate change. But building that reputation over time, you just can't do it overnight. And being willing to go to meetings and testify and volunteering at first, and pretty soon people start calling. And it really is nice because I know they're going to be on our side next time.
yeah. Edward Mann has a question or a comment also.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, where I live, often these issues do not become available to the general public. Sometimes they don't even arise to the school board level or even often to a building administrator level, because you're dealing with a young teacher without tenure and just a sideward comment from a senior teacher or something like that. And this has happened, sure, in the most rural school districts, but I've also seen it happen in the school district right next to a major university.
Mm-hmm.
But in the context that I said, that it's not something you're going to find in the minutes of any meeting. It may be supported by the people who attend those meetings, but you're not going to find it there.
Yeah, I mean it's just gathering that intelligence is really tricky. This is something that we came across recently when the Heartland Institute, which is a climate change denial group, mailed out copies of a pseudoscientific report that they put together that's meant to counter the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that just came out. And it's hard to know what teachers got it and what if they're doing anything with it. So we put on our website a little survey that people could take to say, did you get this? Which schools was it sent to? Which schools wasn't it sent to? To just try to get a sense of how far it's spread. And right now, here, let me pull this up actually on screen. Oh, shoot. But, so we've gotten reports from most of the country, but this is about 300 people who've written in, which is not half bad. But I would be shocked if it was sent to Florida but not Louisiana. This is clearly not fully representative of what's actually happening out there. So it's really difficult to know in the 17,000 school districts what's happening in any given one of them.
I'd have to concur.
And then, where am I? Oh, Randall McLemore has a question. Hold on. Or Raleigh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry I was late. One thing to consider is to use a science event, like we use family science. I just retired, but we use family science quite a bit, and to within the family science event, have certain things that will draw interest and encourage kind of learning and discussion around issues. Carbon dioxide, comparative biology, DNA, and use these to kind of softly approach it. Well, that is to say, not to be so, to use it to just teach and make it a teachable moment. And the other thing, and also a positive thing, try and get publicity around the event. And should it cause controversy around climate change or evolution, that's probably a good thing if it's done in the context of teachers working hard to teach. I don't think that's ever a bad thing, although I know I live in the Bay Area, so maybe it's different. It's easier for us possibly.
Yeah, done carefully, it becomes a teachable moment then.
I think so. The other thing is to consider bringing in for the parents, something that will draw out the discussion. I mean, even Al Gore's thing, possibly show the Heartland Institute thing on those amazing solar cycles, and have a debate. I mean, I know that can be confusing and it can be lost. But I still think it's worth using it as a teachable moment. And the last thing is in the publicity to encourage using groups that undercut, the pillars in terms of things like the World Bank is preparing for this. It's not the assumption that there isn't climate change among certain people that some deniers might have
right.
Respect for. Say, no, for them climate change is real.
Yeah, the insurance industry, the military
exactly.
are they're not even. It's not about whether it's happening. They're planning for it.
Right.
The military is really a leader in clean energy because they were hauling a lot of the attacks on convoys in Iraq and Afghanistan are convoys pulling oil out to military bases. If they can set up a solar cell, or if they can set up a wind turbine or some other renewable source of energy that they don't have to haul gasoline all over the place, it saves lives. This is real stuff. And it's something that the Navy is planning for. It's something that the insurance industry is planning for. I will say, though, about the idea of debate is really risky to set up. A debate about policy, sure. I mean, that's how policy is done. But setting up a debate over the science can be really problematic because it doesn't just leave the possibility that scientific misinformation will get reinforced to an audience, but it also, to my way of thinking, it really gets it shows people the wrong idea about how science works, how scientific questions are resolved. It's not done through stage debate. It's done in the literature. It's done based on evidence. And in a debate, you don't have time to go and check the literature and think carefully about it. And that's why when I was starting out, before I started NCSE and involved in the Kansas science standards fights, it was good that when the board tried to create a debate format that would decide what was in science standards, the scientific community said no. They boycotted the whole process, and I think ultimately that was all to the good. Keith Miller mentions one thing that KCFS, Kansas Citizens for Science, has done over the last few years is sponsor awards for student science fair projects and provide financial support for teachers to attend state science teacher meetings, gives us visibility and educational partners. I know a group called the Alliance for Science in Virginia, which was the Virginia Citizens for Science group, did something similar. They had an essay contest for high school students to write an essay about the importance of evolution in their life. And I don't remember what the prize was. It wasn't anything. It was probably $500 or $1,000. But again, a way to get themselves out there and to emphasize the importance of these issues to the students.